say that.
Yeah. So tell me more about that.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah.
Right. So we were just talking about how aerosol back in the 80s, correct?
Yeah, it was the 70s, 80s.
70s, 80s. How the world collectively came together to say, hey, how about we don't use this anymore? It's not really a good thing. It's destroying the ozone layer, and we really need that.
Mm-hmm.
So the world collectively said, all right, let's stop using it. And
Reductionist, yes, because there was a lot of pushback from corporations and government agencies and stuff like that. But definitely there was like it was a process. It was a movement towards that,
And so you were the one that brought that up. My initial response to that in regards to plastics was like, well, plastics are everywhere. I mean, when I pack my lunch, I have yogurt. I'm gonna want granola with it. I put that in a little
everything has plastic,
cup, little plastic bag, right? Like super super small one.
You don't even give it a second thought,
Right. I mean, honestly, when I grab them, I'm like, all right, cool.
Really?
I do give thought to it.
Okay.
I am aware of the issue. I choose not to do anything about it because it is convenient.
It is, yeah, and it's like it's not just convenient. It's also the fact that it's inconvenient to look for alternatives to that. You know what I mean? Because, like you said, like everything that you see when you go into a grocery store is going to be wrapped in plastic. My name is Sage Fravala. I'm a senior student at the University of North Florida. I'm in a technical communication class about embodied environmental risk, and I did a survey on microplastic awareness among students in my class to gauge how or what the level of understanding surrounding the issue of microplastics is amongst university students. I'm joined here today by Spencer Robinson.
Hello.
He is also a student at Florida Polytechnic University in computer engineering.
Yes, that would be correct. I'm currently a junior, and I'm an intern at SEL,
which is a power grid.
To be specific, it is a relay manufacturer for the power grid.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I have brought Spencer in today to talk about microplastics and how it relates to so many different things, from health issues to energy production, which is something that I'm very fascinated in. We'll get into just a little bit later, because I mean, I think it goes without saying, because plastic is a byproduct of oil extraction, that shifting our energy grid and our main energy sources is going to help us combat the issue of plastic production and microplastic pollution worldwide. Tell me a little bit about how the world of computer engineering intersects with plastic production.
The one example that almost immediately would come to mind is my internship, where we are a relay manufacturer. And so the front covering, big blue, all plastic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just like flimsy plastic. It is hard, rigid, really what I would think of as solid, well-made plastic.
Yeah.
And so that's my first thought. And there's relays everywhere. And we're not the only company doing relays for the power grid. There's a bunch of them.
Yeah, this is like a nationwide project.
International. Every country, every continent needs this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In some way, shape, or form. And so that was my first thought of where is it? Where do I see it? It's just at work. I see it every day. It's just already, yeah. So this is this, boom.
It's kind of like you give thought to it, but at the same time, it's such an integral part of your life. Like, for example, breathing it's I mean, yeah, sure, we think about it, but you do it so often that you just kind of, it's not at the forefront of your mind all of the time. And I think that plastic is similar, to where it's so ubiquitous and it's just around us. in pretty much every way and shape of our lives. That like, yeah, we can give it some thought, but like for the most part, it's just kind of in the background in our subconscious looming.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of any computer case or your
Mm-hmm.
car dashboard or your console, right? Stuff that is, I would say, right, there's a level of coding and a low level of hardware. You need to integrate those two. You kind of need to put it in a box, in the most convenient box that is cheap,
Mm-hmm.
easy to produce, everywhere is plastic.
Yeah, it's durable too. And I love what you said earlier about you can tell that it's well made plastic. I feel like we do have similar to water, for example, right? I know this sounds crazy, but like you taste water
Yep.
and you can immediately tell
Like,
what the quality of it is, right?
Yeah.
Like so one question on the survey that I created, and we'll get to this a little bit later, was can you tell when a product is wrapped in plastic, right? Um, and the majority of people said no. But funnily enough, there was another question that said, which tastes better, a beverage out of a plastic bottle or out of a can? Nearly everybody said can. But they said that they couldn't really tell the difference between the taste of it. But it seems like there's something else happening there psychologically.
I think on that specific question, those sets of questions, I think people, excuse me, disconnect that drinking a Coke out of a 16 ounce plastic bottle compared to a 12 ounce like short can is different. I think people disconnect that because it's both Coke.
Yeah.
But like your body, you are very subconsciously able to detect that difference, but you're never fully aware and recognizing it.
Yeah, like similar to the taste of water, or even going back to what we were saying with the quality of plastic, which you were talking about with computer cases and
Yeah.
stuff. Like you can tell when plastic is good plastic. It's durable. It doesn't feel like it's gonna disintegrate, you know?
Like I can grab it, and if I really tried, I can push against it, and it won't immediately snap, or it won't like deflect a lot.
Yeah. Because plastic is, I mean, there was definitely a time in history where it wasn't everywhere, but now it's been such a convenient invention that I mean, we really do see it everywhere at this point, and we have standards for it, I suppose, in our mind as well, just like similar to the taste between a can of Coke and a bottle of Coke, where it's not something that you might immediately think of, but if you purchase a product and it's wrapped in good plastic, you can associate that with the quality of the overall product. I suppose.
Yeah.
It definitely affects your judgment.
Yeah, I mean, I've never. Right, we both have our water bottles here.
Mm-hmm.
I've never drinking it without the lid. So my experience is purely the metal container to just like that plastic mouthpiece. Have you drank out of your water bottle without like the
Not really,
lid on
no. It's like kind of a piece of it, It's not the same experience, I suppose.
And so like we're both unaware of what does our water taste like without that lid. And so
yeah, it's very much like a texture thing, but I mean, when you put it like that, it is the first point of experience with consumption, I guess. And I think that there is something that we could definitely get more into later about the overall experience of consumption and how it relates with plastic in general, and how can we reorient ourselves to, I guess, make plastic not the first point of contact in pretty much every single purchase that we make, especially when it comes to things like computing or, I mean, just water bottles, which is crazy to think about. Let's segue into what we're actually going to talk about, which is microplastics. Because plastic as a whole is just such a broad term. There's everything from food grade plastic to, you know what I mean? Like there's so many different categories of it. And we kind of don't make the distinction between those a lot of time. But
plastic is plastic.
plastic is
Boom.
plastic, yeah. So what, I'm sure you've heard of microplastic. Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so do you know what microplastic is?
So
the working definition of it.
If I were to surmise what I think of microplastic, it would probably be degradation of certain plastics. I wouldn't surprise me if all plastics produce microplastics, some more than others, but it is just the degradation of material that then is very good at latching onto other things and transporting itself to places that it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic definition of it. Usually microplastic is just a couple millimeters in diameter, sometimes smaller than that. It really can be microscopic as well. There's some pretty shocking images that I've seen of people like taking a microscopic view of their car keys, for example. And upon first glance, a lot of people, or dollar bills, for example, somebody put a dollar bill under a microscope, and I kid you not, the initial response that people had was, it looks like there was cocaine on the dollar bill. And while that wouldn't necessarily be super shocking, it's actually microplastic. It's covered. It's everywhere. So much so that, like with what you were saying about how it degrades, it's not visible in a lot of manners. Something pretty shocking that I discovered in my research for this report was that the average person globally eats about 5 grams of plastic a week, about a credit card's worth.
Where does that come from in specific, typically?
So it's so many sources that we really can't narrow it down entirely, especially since plastic has become so integrated into our daily lives that we actually don't have much of a control group for a lot of this stuff, because it is everywhere. So we, especially when it comes to measuring the health risks and stuff like that, we don't know a lot of these things. However, the highest sources of food contamination, for example, because we're talking about people consuming plastic, seafood has the highest content of microplastic.
And that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise when you think about, I mean, most people, when they hear pollution or something like that, they think about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, or just plastic and water
pollution.
Yeah, water pollution particularly. So seafood is the highest content, but it can be found in everything, in trace amounts, in even just vegetables, produce, because it's in the soil, because of pesticides and so many other things. So it's kind of a multifaceted thing where we don't know entirely where it comes from. We just have kind of guesstimates on various factors. So it depends on what your diet is. It depends on where you live. It depends on if you're eating more seafood in your diet, which a lot of people in Asia, Indochina in particular, Vietnam, and Indonesia have been seeing significantly worse consequences when it comes to microplastic contamination in blood and stuff like that.
And I feel like that region of the world also is a large producer. I will admit I am uneducated on this specific topic, but if I were to guess, this is also an area of the world that is a large producer of plastic, or a large consumption of plastic.
To a degree. So China and the United States are hands down the biggest producers of plastic. That should come as no surprise. So China does. Well, let's talk about the United States, because that's where we are. So, and we can get into Indochina in a second. But the United States has kind of this policy of we are great at trying to make this image of like, oh, we recycle our stuff and whatnot, right? But actually the case happens to be that we export a lot of our trash to countries like Indonesia and countries in Africa. And a lot of countries overseas are actually now starting to write legislation that bans countries from exporting their trash. And this has actually really rubbed people in the United States the wrong way, because now we're not able to remove it from our view. We have to deal with it more directly. So, and I'm not sure necessarily about China, but a lot of pollution that comes out of China does end up in Vietnam, in Thailand, in Indonesia, Malaysia.
Wow, when my actions have consequences.
Yeah, crazy. What a concept, right? But yeah, so there definitely is a disproportionate level of microplastic consumption because of the seafood heavy diet in a lot of areas of Indochina and just the world in general. Seafood, I mean, we get the majority of our food from the ocean, and that's not necessarily the case in the American diet.
No.
Because we have, I mean, that's a whole conversation in itself. That could be an entire podcast on just how different the American diet is from pretty much all of the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, so okay. Oh yes. So let's talk about the health risks associated with consuming plastic, because we did give that pretty shocking credit card statistic, and you know, a lot of people might be quick to say, well, I don't consume that much plastic, right? I think that's the easiest thing to go to.
Ignoring it.
Yeah.
Just to kind of avoid being like, oh, that couldn't be me.
Especially since you're not like, you know, you don't have
it.
like a credit card portion of plastic on your plate. It's not visible. It's in very small quantities.
Yeah. And because when you said that, the reason I asked that follow-up question, like, so what foods contain that the most, is because I am concerned about my health. I am concerned and curious as well about like what foods contain it, because my diet really consists of eggs, bread, yogurt, and chicken.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Maybe some ground beef and steak. That's real pasta. Right?
Yeah.
And like that's majority of my diet.
The rule of thumb is like pretty much everything has plastic in it. I think that the food group that contains the least amount of it has to be produce and stuff, obviously, like fresh vegetables, fruits. You know, meats are typically more likely to have concentrations of microplastics, especially when you consider, I mean, it's such a complicated
there's a lot of levels to
it. Yeah, because so microplastic can travel through literally any medium, just like any other type of material. So I mean, if your food is wrapped in plastic, your food has microplastic in it, and microplastic also it evaporates out of water and it can travel through rainwater.
Yeah,
there's estimates that, you know, literally thousands of metric tons of plastic fall out of rainwater in the United States alone every year. And that's not even to mention where our chickens, for example, are getting their food. You know, if their feed is wrapped in plastic, those chickens are consuming microplastic as well. So it's this very complicated cycle of we don't have entire figures on where plastic is coming from. It just
it's unobtrusive.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so difficult to measure that without dropping literally everything. I mean, I suppose it would take billions of dollars of funding to actually
diagnose what's going on.
Yeah, to get some decent figures on what's actually happening. But in relation to the actual consumption of microplastics, there have been a number of associated health risks that are starting to be measured, I suppose is the word. We, again, like I said earlier, we don't necessarily have a control group for this. There is nobody on this planet right now that is totally outside of microplastic contamination. It's something that everybody is dealing with. Everybody from people in the inner cities of New York all the way to indigenous communities in Alaska and Russia.
And so I feel like the best control group that you can have is the one that's minimally exposed, the one that is exposed to it the least. So those indigenous groups, how are they responding to it? But then again, there's so many factors related to diet, living conditions.
Exactly, and a lot of indigenous communities get their food from the ocean.
Yep.
And so it's not like they're totally excluded from this. So I want to ask you, are you aware of any of the associated health risks of consuming microplastic?
No. Would you like me to take an educated guess?
I have at it.
If I were to guess its consumption, right, either through liquid or food, and so it is probably affecting liver, kidney, gut health. I wouldn't suspect anything with your heart. Maybe by proxies of those three systems, gut, liver, and kidney, there's some effect on your heart. But those would be my guesses, is that it's mainly the internal organs that are processing your food and liquids.
I'm gonna hit you with some pretty disturbing,
some cold water.
Yeah, this is going to be a wake-up call. And again, a lot of people tend to avoid this information because it is inherently distressing. I mean, there's really nothing nice about having this conversation.
Yeah, you're gonna die in the next few days. Hope you know that.
Oh yeah. Well, thankfully, I don't think we're quite there yet, because plastic has existed since really World War II. And people are definitely still alive from them. So it's not like you're going to die tomorrow. But we have actually been measuring the accumulation of microplastic in the organs and the effects on this. And I mean, there has been microplastic recorded in everything from blood. Blood samples now have microplastic in them, to human placenta have microplastic in them.
I've heard of baby, like I saw a headline posted probably a year or two ago, where it's just like, cool guys, we have the first baby that was born with microplastics in them, which is like, oh yeah, interesting.
Even breast milk has microplastic in it now.
Okay.
So I mean, children, before they even come into this world, are being exposed to microplastic. And that's not even to get into the actual health conditions that are associated with having microplastic in breast milk and in blood and placenta. There have been measures of everything from neurotoxicity, developmental toxicity, reproductive system issues, immune system weakness, neurotoxicity. There are so many different symptoms that are associated with microplastic accumulation in the body, and we're still discovering new things about this.
2 questions. One, how are we diagnosing that the microplastics are the issue with this?
That's a great question. What's your other question, real quick?
And then the second question, I appreciate you asking that, because I would totally forget it.
Yeah, I would too.
I guess this is a similar vein, but it is separate. How is it getting from my gut to those other organs? Because how I view and this is probably a failure of anatomy on me, right? How I view my gut is already, boom, I see it now.
It's like a one-way system. You're ingesting it and then it's going in one direction, right?
Yeah, that's how I was about to view it. But then I'm like, as soon as I started talking about it, I said, well, it has to digest the food, and in order to digest the food, it has to, dissolve it, and then get all the minerals, nutrients, microplastics.
And then your body can't tell the difference between those things. It just treats it all equally.
Oh yeah, but it can tell the difference between Jim's left arm being on my left arm. Great job, buddy.
And that follows your second question. So how do we actually know that it's the microplastic that's causing these issues? Yeah. And that's a very complicated question to answer. And I hate that word, complicated. But for the sake of this, okay, and I am no biochemist or neurosurgeon by any means, but just a very long time of having studied these effects, there's a pretty strong correlation to specific reproductive system failures, for example, or developmental issues, and being exposed to different concentrations. That's pretty much the best indicator that we have of it, is not necessarily the one-to-one correlation with plastic causes these issues. It's more of the concentration of plastic. How much plastic do you have in your system?
Yeah.
And are you more likely to suffer from associated neurotoxicity symptoms? So the best answer that I have for that is we aren't entirely sure.
Okay.
This is still like a developing science for sure. And also, like we were talking about earlier, with some communities that are less exposed to plastic, typically have less correlation between a lot of these symptoms.
Because that's always something that's in the back of my mind is out of fun just looking at trends between X and Y, right? And saying, alrighty, there's a correlation between these two, but is this correlation the cause of that?
Yes.
Right. And so I think that's something that you could probably do hours and days and weeks upon of research to say, is the increase in microplastics that we're seeing and the increase of these health effects, is this the cause of this?
Yeah,
and that's a very obviously, like you kind of preface, you're not a neurosurgeon, you're not
Yeah.
any medical professional, so you can't say with certainty, but
yeah,
that is something that you need to be concerned about.
Statistical significance is the strongest indicator that we have, and a lot of people have kind of discredited statistics in these manners because you'll hear typically from certain groups that try to discredit statistics, that we can ignore problems with pollution, for example, and climate change in particular, because these issues really aren't inseparable from each other. If we're talking about climate change, naturally, we're going to have to talk about the microplastic crisis that's happening right now, because this is one of the greatest contributors to climate change. So generally, statistical significance is the best indicator that we have of the association between these symptoms and the concentration of microplastics in the blood, or just in the body in general. And now we're starting to do more research on the actual transference of microplastics from one body to another. It's similar to bloodborne diseases, right? Because if you can ingest microplastics as an infant through breast milk or through formula, like that's extremely concerning. So we don't we can't really mitigate the consumption of microplastic right now. Of course, you can try to change your diet a little bit, eat less seafood, but that's unfortunately not an option for many people who rely on specific food sources, for example, or especially infants. It's not like you have much of a choice except to have breast milk or formula, when you're not able to chew things.
They got no teeth.
Let's talk about this survey for a second. Okay, so like I mentioned, I am in a technical communication class about embodied environmental risk. Embodiment. Are you familiar with embodiment at all?
Embodiment? Probably not, because the way I'm thinking of it is just like the embodiment of a field. Like, this is what this would mean, or this is the general idea of what this is.
I think you're getting close to it, which is embodiment refers to the interrelationships between human bodies, animal bodies, the environment, how these issues are not totally inseparable from each other. So if we're talking about plastic being dumped into the ocean, it's very easy for us to be like, well, I don't care about that. You know what I mean? That doesn't affect me, but like it does, because if you eat fish, that's coming back into your body. So it's inseparable. We're talking about embodiment as a way to measure interrelationships between different species, different environments on this planet, and the effects of how things on one side of the globe are causing repercussions on the other side of the globe. And this is especially important when we were talking about the United States and China exporting their waste to developing countries. So I've been working on this project for quite a while now. My main concern and focus of this whole project was, yes, I'm interested in learning about microplastics and the associated health risks of ingesting microplastics. How can we mitigate the production of microplastic? How can we prevent it from getting into the environment? How can we catch it so it doesn't transfer one environment to the other? But that is an extremely difficult issue to tackle without increasing awareness about these issues. Particularly, my focus was on college students. How aware are we about these issues? Because I've looked at some studies. I looked at one study from Shanghai, which was just measuring the average citizen's general awareness of microplastic. Have you heard the term? A lot of people in Shanghai had heard the term. Very, very few people actually knew what it meant, or what and if we don't know what the definition of microplastic is, we can't really get into the symptoms or the causes of health issues and stuff like that. And then also, it's another study that was done in Poland, and this was just on college students at a university. And it seemed that a lot of them knew what microplastic was, could give a definition of it, and then a decent amount of them, not the overwhelming majority by any means, were able to identify the sources of it, which, if we're talking about the main causes of it, because you did mention earlier that microplastic is inevitable with any plastic. It's going to degrade, it's going to erode, it's going to transfer itself into different environments. That's just true of any substance on this planet.
That's how it be.
That is how it be. But the main really big causers of microplastics are tread on tires.
Really?
Yes, very surprising, right? So tread on tires, cosmetic products, so everything from shampoo bottles to makeup wipes to a lot of these are like single use, right? And don't get recycled or can't be recycled in a lot of areas because, like, for example, in Florida, I want to say it's number 3 and number 6 plastics that aren't being taken anymore. And this isn't even talking about glass or anything else like that, which also have trace amounts of plastic on them with the labels and stuff like that.
Where I live, where I live down there, it's been like slow rollout. But back in I would say October, November, they said we're no longer accepting recycling.
Wow.
And then
just any recycling?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
I haven't even heard about this.
Say the reason was that they presented. I think it is also happening maybe in this neighborhood. I'm not sure.
Really.
But the reason that I've heard was that the price increase was too much. Right? They're trying to double the cost. The recycling plant is trying to double the cost that they're charging to come pick it up, process it.
That's shocking. And I think it's important to mention that only 9% of all plastic that has ever been produced has actually been recycled. And this is just talking about recycling it once, right? If we're talking about sustainable networks of producing materials, right? Recycling something doesn't mean recycling it one time and then throwing it away again. That just makes it from single use to double use, which, don't get me wrong, is still an improvement compared to what we're doing now, which is just producing it and wasting it.
Yeah.
But it's still not a sustainable model for what we should be aiming at in the future. And it really shocks me to hear that they're now rolling out just getting rid of recycling programs, because that is actually something that's probably important to talk about, is the price of recycling and what materials are actually useful.
Worthwhile to recycle.
Yeah, right. Which are going to get the most profit. Yeah. Which are going to make the most revenue. And unfortunately, plastic is not very profitable to recycle. And that just leads us to the question of, if it's not profitable to recycle, then why are we producing it?
Because it's profitable first time.
Yeah, because it's cheap, it's easy to produce, and it's a byproduct of just crude oil extraction. So I mean, you're getting natural gas, which is very, very useful to produce energy. And we'll talk about that when we talk a little bit about your internship at the power grid. But I mean, it's practically dirt cheap, and you can produce lots of it for pennies on a dollar. And I will mention, because I think it's important to talk about the alternatives to single-use plastic production, because we're trying to reorient our model of development in product production. There are now, in Mexico, for example, there's this huge initiative, I want to say it's in Yucatan, to take avocado pits, which are already wasted, just thrown away when you're producing guacamole or anything like that. These avocado pits, when they're ground up, can actually make an extremely durable plastic-like material. And it degrades in a couple months and can be composted. And this is a new avenue that's being explored for product containers. So if you're buying, let's say, a shampoo bottle, right, or something along the lines, a cosmetic product, which
something that should only last 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, you're probably just going to take that plastic bottle and throw it away, especially if it's not recyclable in your area, or if your area even does recycling, because as we're talking about, it's kind of backfiring, and people are trying to roll out, or I guess get rid of recycling. Roll back
those policies.
Yeah. So yeah, this is an extremely it could be an extremely lucrative field, and this is just one of many things that are being explored right now. This isn't even to mention on the end of cleaning, right? Because even if we start making everything with avocado pits or with mycelium or something like that, that doesn't solve the problem of plastic that's currently in the world. And scientists are currently engineering worms, for example, to be able to digest plastics.
That I've heard about. I thought it was slugs.
Might be slugs, worms, just
some small squiggly creature.
Yeah, yeah. But let's circle around to this survey, right? So there were 13 people that were studied. 7 of them were undergraduate students, 5 were graduate students. Vast majority of them are in their early 20s, with the exception of an outlier who was in the later 30s, right? I asked these participants where they received their information on current events, and the vast majority of them said social media. A lot of them said traditional news outlets as well, email, forums, family, friends, word of mouth, but the vast majority of them responded with social media. Have you been seeing on your feed recently, with whichever social media that you use, more information about recycling, about sustainable initiatives?
Recently, I don't believe so. I feel like I can recall maybe smaller instances, like 1 or 2. My main social media would be Instagram.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's the vast majority of Americans.
Yeah. And so Reels, as always, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I might have seen within the past few days, probably 10, maybe probably around 10, maybe a little less, saying you should be aware of this. So this health benefit or this health risk, instead of this, do this.
Do you think that the majority of the content that you see talking about sustainability or environmental destruction is geared more to people who are hopeless, and it kind of feeds on the hopeless energy of, well, we can't stop plastic production? Or do you think the vast majority of content is more hopeful?
I think a vast majority of it is just trying to make light of the issue.
Yeah, you think it's more positive?
I don't know if it's I don't feel confident speaking to the connotation or the tone of those videos, but
Mm.
I can confidently say like they are truly purely just trying to say like, hey, this is what this is.
They have intentions to educate, not necessarily to paint something in a good or a bad light.
Yeah, I don't think it's any fear mongering or like look out for the war, like don't worry, we're gonna be okay, like any of those sort of motifs. It's purely just, hey, this is what it is.
Presenting it in a neutral manner.
This is how you should look at it. Go about it as you do, but these are my recommendations.
Okay. That's pretty important to keep in mind, talking about just where people receive their current events and stuff before we get into the meat and potatoes of this study. Because I do think that it affects people, how they respond to extremely stressful information like learning about microplastics.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, the vast majority of people that responded to this survey said that they intentionally avoided information about microplastics because they felt that it was just one of those things that we can't control. Actually, one student in particular, in their written responses, replied, it was a convenient invention, one that has fucked us. This was coming from a graduate student. I was extremely surprised to read that. Only around 53% of people that were surveyed said that they knew the sources of microplastic, but later written response revealed that that might have been more nuanced because a lot of people responded with kind of vague answers like pollution or plastic production and weren't really giving specific sources. I actually want to say only one respondent actually named a specific causer of microplastic pollution, which was tires. Only one in a graduate level class.
I just find it humorous that people are saying, yeah, microplastics are caused by plastics. Did you know that?
Yeah, right. Black is white, you know. I think that, and this study doesn't contain enough information to reveal greater trends through just American education in general. But I personally would say that Americans are probably less likely to be educated on microplastic compared to studies that I've seen from other countries like China and Poland, like we were talking about earlier. Let's get into the actual data of the responses. And we're only going to be looking at the multiple choice questions because I don't have time to go into the free responses, unfortunately. But if you're curious, you absolutely can you can take a look at this on your own time. This is publicly available at this point. Okay, so of the 13 people that were surveyed, 61% said that they tried to avoid single-use plastics. 38% said that they didn't. Do you try to avoid single-use plastics? Be totally honest with me.
I don't put a lot of thought to it.
Yeah, it's kind of like I gotta eat.
Say, if we were to look at what I do, right, of how I meal prep or consume my food, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I pack my lunch, I have some yogurt.
Mm-hmm.
I use single-use plastic to pack some granola with that, right? My chicken breasts, I piece that apart. I put those into their own quart freezer bags. Right. Once I'm defrosted it, take the chicken out, cut them board, throw that plastic away.
Yeah, it's like you don't give it a second thought.
Because the thought that I'm giving is, ooh, salmonella, get this in the trash.
Yeah, right. It's not like you can use a plastic bag that held raw chicken in it again. Yeah, that's extremely dangerous.
And so, but I also use, right, when I meal prep, I use the same plastic containers, which microplastics, however, I'm reusing. I wash them.
Mm-hmm.
I probably put them through 10, 20 different dishes at this point.
Yeah.
Right. And so I try to be conscious of it to the benefit, but at the same time, it is a convenient thing.
Yeah. Okay.
It is a big convenience.
I would say that probably represents the vast majority of Americans, because at this point in time, I feel like people have heard plastic bad. Okay, especially considering it is literally a byproduct of crude oil extraction and purification. So, eating food that has been wrapped in something that's created as a byproduct of natural gas probably is going to be toxic. Thing. Yeah. I don't know how people didn't think of this. Yeah, I don't know how people didn't think of this stuff.
Oh man, the thing that makes my car go vroom vroom. You know the thing that like kind of comes out of that? Like,
yeah, it explodes.
Yeah, like lights on fire really bad. What if we treated it in a goofy way? And now I put my food in it.
Yeah, my water. That's another one is water. It just leaches into it. Like if you leave a plastic water bottle
in the sun.
Yeah,
I know that's
like it's extremely dangerous. You're just chugging those microplastics. Okay. Oof. So, as we've kind of seen so far, currently students don't have the level of awareness that's necessary to begin to take action and change. Again, because the university is the heart of a lot of movements towards creating social change, especially environmental justice. And if our students, who are representing the most educated people in our country, now that might not always be the case, but
I would say that statement is probably like the most like recently educated, willing to learn, being engulfed in that environment.
Yeah, definitely learning to critical think. If we're not talking about these issues, specifically about microplastics, which is probably the greatest threat to our species right now, I would say, especially for the long term, as we continue to understand what some of these associated health risks are with accumulating microplastics in the organs. It's important that we begin to talk about these things if we are actually serious about moving away from it.
Yeah.
So, in relation to increasing awareness around this stuff, what do you think that we can do? What do you think that we can do to get people to start talking about this without just losing their minds? Because it is so stressful to think about these things.
The thing that this kind of reminds me of, because it is a very detrimental, large-scale issue, is COVID, right? During the peak of the pandemic, you would constantly just see on the news, this many cases today, this many new people died today.
Kind of desensitized people to it, right? Yeah.
And so I personally, I don't know about you, after a certain while, I'm like, oh, cool, COVID.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you get desensitized to it, and it stops having a meaning.
Yeah, right. I've gotten sick with COVID twice. The first time, the university was like, go home, don't come here, you got the plague.
I'm very proud to say I've never caught COVID.
You're very lucky.
I am very, very lucky.
Right. The second time, right, I went through the same procedure as the first time, like, message this on-campus facility. Okay, message your professors first.
Yeah.
Right, by the second time, and it was about a year and a half in between, right? The second time I was like, okay, moving on. Let's go and womp, deal with it.
Yeah.
And so,
wow,
I would say that would be a very real issue to face if you're trying to present this to a mass population to say, hey, this is an issue. You can't shove this information down people's throat.
Yeah, it's extremely important with how we approach it so that we don't desensitize people to it like we did with COVID.
And the other thing is that when you go into it, you have to accept people will still love blissful ignorance.
Yeah.
People will just ignore your information, not do anything with it, and continue to say, hey, Ziploc, I'm going to buy a whole box of those. I'm going to use it in a week. Right?
Yeah.
And you can't change that. As long as the commodity is available, people will buy it.
So
Because it is a
that leads
commodity.
me to another question, actually. Do you think that we should be banning plastics federally? Or at least regulating the production of plastic?
I think the first step should be regulation.
Mhm.
And before you move to a federal ban, have a solution.
I
Right.
definitely agree. But what do you think the regulation of it would look like then, as we continue to explore new avenues of what can we, uh, what can we wrap products in? What can we use as an alternative to Ziploc bags?
There would be two things, and one would probably, this is more political,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Naturally.
One option is going to be one side, view of the two sides, blue and red, right? This option will make them happy, right? Blue happy. The other one will make red happy, right? Blue happy, taxing.
Wow.
Make it unprofitable.
We've seen this in states like Colorado with now charging people to purchase plastic bags at grocery stores.
Right. Make it unprofitable. Don't give them an incentive to buy it.
Okay.
Right. Either as a consumer or as a corporation. The other one, and I don't know. I don't think either side actually would be happy about this.
All right. Change is scary.
But would be to give funding to these corporations to say, hey, instead of producing these products, produce this more expensive option and we'll offset that cost.
Interesting. Now, I haven't heard that because, I mean, something that is extremely controversial right now is the amount of corporate bailouts that we're giving people right now.
And that's the thing that I don't think any side would be happy about it.
Yeah. I don't think any side would be happy about it, although it might be a legitimate avenue to consider. I personally wouldn't support that, but when it comes to regulating corporations in this country, I mean, we've kind of gotten to a point where that's not happening.
Yeah.
Like in any respect, because lobbyists control Congress and they're absolutely trying to benefit themselves and make it as profitable as possible. So in relation to how do we actually get corporations to respond to this crisis that they're creating, I would say that it definitely is going to have to involve a huge political dynamic shift. But we obviously don't have time to talk about that, nor should we. Nor should we talk about that in this podcast. But as far as in relation to your internship, what you're doing right now with the power grid, right? What do you think that we can do to shift energy production to being more sustainable? Because we think of plastic as kind of just being like a very single issue, like it exists in a vacuum, but it definitely does have a lot to do with energy production because the extraction of oil directly contributes to things like our power grid, but also to plastic production. So I personally thought that it might be interesting to talk to you about what this might look like. How do we shift away from oil in general to decrease plastic production, and what would that look like, or what do you think about that?
So I will preface this with I'm probably not as educated as I would like to be. However, I'm still aware of ideas, options, and some solutions. Right? Renewable energy, great thing, not sustainable. You need a lot of land and you need a lot of money to do those things. You always hear about wind farms, right? They can produce a good amount of energy, but by the time that they've broken down, I'm not even sure from what I've heard that they've broken their cost. I don't know if they are net profit. I think they are either net loss or net neutral.
This is a pretty controversial topic in renewable energy right now. Is how do we make renewable energy an option for people if it's not profitable? Because it seems like the economy seems to be getting in the way of renewable energy initiatives. And personally, I think that the cost factor definitely is a concern. But I think what's significantly more concerning is that, and we talked about this a little bit before we actually sat down and started recording, but for example, batteries, renewable energy, it has a very human cost to it, especially since precious metals like lithium and cobalt are extracted using slave labor in countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, especially child labor. The batteries that are in our iPhones,
electric vehicles,
or electric vehicles, for example, are directly sourced from countries that are being exploited. So the question now, I guess, is how do we restructure our power grid to be more sustainable without exploiting other countries' resources? Because this directly contributes to how we're going to approach the microplastic situation. Because if we can't stop oil production and extraction, there will be no pressure to shift from using oil to produce plastics.
I think so. My two comments is one, this is again before we started recording. If we don't make a shift or a good solution from plastics and we continue to use them, but we make a shift in power production, we no longer require oil or gasoline to produce that, I wouldn't be surprised, right, to see oil refinement still happening so we can produce plastics, like you mentioned with Hyperion.
Yes. Right. Okay. And just context for the listeners. We exchange books with each other. I'm reading this series that Spencer completed a while ago called Hyperion, and it's a science fiction novel of after a huge catastrophe has affected the Earth. Long story short, they have shifted away from using oil for energy production, but they're still extracting oil to produce plastics. And so that, I think that that's definitely a legitimate concern to have.
But the shift that I wouldn't be surprised to see, and I would enjoy seeing, is a bigger shift to natural gas and nuclear options.
Nuclear energy, okay.
Because
why natural gas? Because I feel like a lot of our listeners are probably going to be conflicted hearing that. What makes natural gas?
When I think of natural gas, I think of geothermal. My apologies. Like geothermal happening like underneath the earth, make hot steam.
Okay, gas as in okay. Interesting.
Like geothermal, like Iceland would do.
Using heat to produce our energy, which is significantly more efficient, and the same reason that you probably prefer nuclear energy.
Because I think this is also a base understanding is, right.
We're not biochemists.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll break it down just like a car, right? In order to make your car go, you need three things. You need gas, air, and something to make that really small, so then combusts, right? In a generator, from my knowledge, it is a very similar process of make things hot, make steam, steam turn turbine, turbine, magnet, electricity, blah, blah, blah.
The oldest forms of the engines that we have,
And so, at the end of the day, it is purely how can we make things, how can we boil water the most efficiently?
Right. Because, boiling water is zero net emissions with carbon. And I think that it's very fascinating because I think the majority of discourse right now is focused on shifting towards solar energy.
Yeah.
And instead of using the sun as the resource for the majority of our energy production, you're saying we should look the opposite way. We should look underneath the earth.
I don't think it will be bad to look up for the sun either. The only negative to that is that obviously when the sun goes away, you don't produce anything. And so, yes, there are forms of battery banks but we don't have, just like we were talking about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
right? Producing batteries is already a terrible thing.
Yes.
And to produce large scale batteries that could power a whole city, that's totally unfeasible.
It's extremely unsustainable.
Unsustainable,
It's
it just can't happen.
counterintuitive to, a lot of people right now are focused on electric vehicles and to, solar energy and stuff, but the resources that are required to produce these things are extremely costly. And additionally, I think that it goes without saying that we also have to look at our lifestyle in general. When it comes to transportation, right? Instead of focusing on creating electric vehicles, maybe make our cities more walkable. Just a thought, maybe create infrastructure for bicycles, something that doesn't require you to create energy.
Yeah. To comment on the nuclear, I don't think I finished the thought on that. I'm very interested in fission because that is a very large sector that frequently pops up on when I go to look up something. It's like, this reactor finally did this.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot about fusion now, which is still we don't have the technological capabilities to replicate fusion, to my understanding.
Yeah.
There are kind of experiments being done now. But okay, so fission.
Mm-hmm. Clarify me, fission is that the traditional one where
this is
235?
With nuclear power plants. Fusion is the reaction that takes place in the core of the sun.
Okay. That's the one that I like hearing about because it truly...
Fusion?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it is truly if we see it in our lifetime,
that would be a game changer.
That would be insane.
Yeah.
Because the amount of research and so much is behind it. I'm a nerd about this because it deals with magnets and it's really cool. But besides the amount of energy that you put in, the goal with it is obviously get more energy out.
Mm-hmm.
And so the energy that you're putting in is hydrogen for a fusion reactor.
Mm-hmm.
So we got hydrogen everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah. It's one of the most abundant resources that we have, to my knowledge, because it is just kind of the most basic.
Yeah.
It's literally one on the periodic table.
And so if we're able to produce something that is able to produce a lot of energy using the most common element that has no everything has a downside, but
hydrogen is very explosive is the concern. But I mean, when comparing it to nuclear reactors, for example,
right,
nuclear waste is extremely difficult to deal with.
And I think it is also at my office, we have a few nuclear technicians from the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And so hearing them talk about how we deal, to be fair, I don't know if this is American government or just the Navy, but how we deal with nuclear, right, it's kind of goofy.
Yeah.
Right? If you're working on the reactor completely off, measure zero radioactivity anywhere, right? Using a screwdriver, you drop the screwdriver on the ground, that's radioactive material. Even if you scan it, even if it has literally nothing on it, reactor off, everything off, there's no way that this could be contaminated. Radioactive material, throw it away.
Wow.
Right.
So
that's wasteful.
Yes.
But also, it's just the regulations on it are so... I can't speak to other countries, but it's very strict in America. And I mean...
Following the Chernobyl disaster,
that's the thing. It's we do have reason to be concerned about it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't ignore that. However, following Chernobyl, I think a lot of people were afraid that is a common occurrence.
Yes, and this is also safety precautions have changed a lot since then, because our understanding of how meltdowns even happen and how we deal with our nuclear waste has changed a lot. But when we're putting this into context of crude oil, right, and in turn plastic production, right, I think that it's kind of we need to pick our poison, because there is going to be waste with any method of energy production, it's a matter of how safe is it. And like we've discussed, because our conversation has kind of shifted from microplastic to more energy production, which is fantastic, by the way, because I think that these problems are inherently connected.
Yeah.
And it's important for us to talk about this. So thank you for your insight. But we're starting to understand the risks of plastic production, of crude oil and whatnot, and the information on particularly oil and carbon emissions has existed since the 70s. Chevron had been doing experiments on climate change all the way back into the 70s, so we understand what the risks of this are at this point. But likewise with nuclear energy, I mean, we've known about these risks again for a while, because Chernobyl happened, in the 80s, I want to say?
I think it's 84, I think.
The 80s, we're going to say.
Yeah. Early. Well, I can commonly say early 80s.
But since then, right, we have had the Fukushima power plant meltdown in Japan after the tsunami. And aside from that, I can't name anything.
It's Chernobyl and Fukushima. Chernobyl was purely human error.
Mm-hmm. Fukushima was a natural disaster.
Yeah.
So it seems like if we're weighing our options, it might be smarter to go with nuclear energy. And again, I am not educated enough to say that the risks are necessarily lower than that of microplastics and of crude oil. But when it comes to the issues that we're dealing with now, right? The vast majority of the public does not have radiation poisoning. However, the vast majority of the public definitely has microplastic poisoning. So it might be one of those things where we shoot ourselves in the foot. Because, and I mean, we did this with plastic, because plastic was the miracle invention. It solved everything, all of our issues. Everything from packaging and storing food, preserving food, to being able to create cases for computers and alternative methods to just packaging anything. So I want to ask you one more question, which is, if we were to drastically shift our focus on our infrastructure and our energy production, what do you think we could do to stop crude oil extraction to produce plastics? Because, like we discussed a little bit with Hyperion, the issue of crude oil extraction and plastics production, it's definitely connected to using oil as our main source of energy right now, but it definitely could manifest itself into. Sorry. It's okay. It could definitely become a little bit of a problem on its own, even if we fix, I say fix, but shift our focus on energy production.
Surmise the question.
So if we move away from oil extraction, what do you think that we could do to actually solve the issue of plastic production? What do you think we could do to replace a lot of our single-use plastics and even our reusable plastics that are in our computers and stuff? Is there any alternative that we're aware of right now to using plastics, particularly in computing?
In computing, I'm not confident to say anything, because I'm thinking, right, we all eat. That's my first thought, right? Instead of plastic, you can use a washable item, cloth, or something to store your food. It's not a great solution, but it is something right now. Because I think the issue is, right, like you said, it's the miracle invention back in the 40s, 30s.
Yeah, it was like post World War II, really.
Yeah. And so, if you think about, we weren't alive then, but if I were to think about what they probably used metal.
Yeah, which is also extremely taxing to produce.
Extremely taxing to produce, extremely expensive to produce. Not everybody's willing to afford that or can. Right. And so the issue becomes, again, it is like you said, it's a miracle invention. It is the thing that makes things easier, more possible.
Can I interject for a second? Have you heard of Project Silica?
No, but if I were to guess, it's making things out of glass instead.
Something that I've been seeing right now, and to my knowledge, what I've read is that Microsoft has essentially perfected the technology of using glass for hardware storing.
That doesn't surprise me.
So
I mean, the science probably is just a crystalline structure. Hold this port, done.
yeah, it's just using the ones and zeros, but like also you can inscribe data in 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
So it's much more space efficient. You can fit several terabytes into a piece of glass that's the size of a thumb drive.
Okay. So I'm just thinking of the science of that. That's actually very interesting.
And they use lasers to read like the inscriptions into this. So it's like totally doesn't use electricity, right? Aside from when you're reading the data, right? So it doesn't require transistors.
It doesn't require any like static electricity to hold that value, to hold it steady there.
And with hard drives, I mean, we know that hard drives are also not like, they don't store data permanently.
No, because they're magnet based and magnets deteriorate.
Yeah, so like a hard drive might give you like, let's say 8 years, probably. Yeah, before it starts corrupting a little bit. Yeah. Whereas this glass, the Project Silica thing that I mentioned, like it's permanent. Like this is a way that we could possibly store data for thousands of years without the pollution, the tech pollution.
So my question to that, because obviously I'm more science based and I'm thinking about that, is I don't know if you can answer this, but how do they write to that?
How do they write the data into it?
Yeah.
A laser. It's like, have you ever seen like, those like the glass cubes that have like models inside them? You know what I mean? Like it's etched inside of it, so you can have a 3D model made into glass by just etching it. That's what they do. So
how would you go about making, right? Because ones and zeros. How would you go about clearing that data?
That's the thing. I don't think that you can clear it.
And that's right. It's a one-time use of 10 terabytes, but I can only write to 10 terabytes once.
This is more of like an alternative for like permanent storage. So like your photos and stuff like that. You know what I mean?
And I mean, even if it wasn't.
This isn't a
commercial solution.
Yeah, it's definitely not a replacement for data that needs to be changed. So it's definitely not going to replace RAM. It's definitely not going to replace any type of like temporary storage system, especially if you're working on like a document or something like that, for example. Like you can't just casually go delete a couple words and then continue writing. It's a lot more nuanced than that. But as for permanent data, it has the ability to definitely reduce the amount of technological pollution that we have, and in turn the microplastic pollution, because the tech industry is a huge causer of microplastic pollution. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Spencer. It has been such a pleasure talking with you and gaining a little bit more insight into not just how we can increase awareness about microplastic productions, but also how can we shift from using plastics, and even broader of a scale, just oil as a whole, and shift our idea of what is energy, where can we get energy, how do we produce it, and how can we make it clean, how can we make it sustainable for future generations so that they don't have to think about these things again.
Of course, it was a really good time being with you. I'm a little more aware of what I'm doing, and I will say throughout our conversation, I'm like, the plastic tins that I put my food in, maybe I should get it. I always make fun of my roommates for it, but because they're really bulky and they're really annoying to move in the fridge. Are. But glass containers, maybe they aren't so bad.
Maybe not. It all starts with a conversation. Genuinely, we can't really start to solve these things unless we talk about them, unless we approach them. And that's been the whole focus of this project that I've been working on, is not just how do we solve the issue, because we're not there yet, unfortunately. We are just not even close to how do we solve the issue. We need to talk about what is the issue, because, not only is it a matter of the future, obviously, but I feel like so much emphasis is put onto the future. We have to save the planet. We have to do all of these things. It's so important that we do this for ourselves, because we're experiencing in real time the effects of microplastic consumption, whether we look at the health risks, the environmental damage, how it's affecting our ecosystems, people in developing countries where we export our trash. It's a huge problem. And, it starts with us changing our consumption habits, because if enough of us do it, it's not going to be profitable to continue producing plastic. And unfortunately, our options are limited right now, because plastic is everywhere, because it's so cheap to produce. But if we as a society, especially a society that's developing a lot of the plastics and producing a lot of the technology to continue producing plastics, if we start to move away from that stuff, the general consumption habits of the globe will probably start to shift as well.
I agree.
Well, thank you for your time. It's absolutely amazing discussion, and we get to, connect it to so many different conversations too. Not just talk about plastic, but also like energy production and computing, and also science fiction.
Yeah,
so many other things.
Very, very diverse discussion.
Yes.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.